Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate an engaged, stable, and inclusive workforce. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every employer's mind: how will my business be impacted? Ensuring the safety and security of residents in assisted living facilities is a top priority for many healthcare employers. Unfortunately, the theft of residents' valuable possessions remains a troubling issue that may undermine trust and well-being of essential healthcare workers. On this episode of We Get Work, we discuss theft in senior care facilities and the practical steps employers can take to mitigate risks proactively. Our hosts today are Luke Breslin, principal in the Berkeley Heights office, and Raha Asadi, associate in the Los Angeles office of Jackson Lewis, and members of the firm's healthcare group. Luke and Raha, the question on everyone's mind today is, what can healthcare employers do to prevent theft in assisted living facilities? And how does that impact my business?
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Raha Asadi. I am an associate at Jackson Lewis in our Los Angeles office. I practice employment litigation and provide advice and counsel to our clients on all workplace-related matters. I'm here with my colleague, Luke Breslin, who will introduce himself.
Thanks, Raha. Yes, my name is Luke Breslin. I'm a principal in the Berkeley Heights office for Jackson Lewis. And my practice primarily consists of litigation as well as advice and counsel. And I work with a number of clients in the assisted living space. So I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Thanks, Luke. So today we're going to be discussing the very specific topic of employment-related issues that come up in assisted living facilities, or ALFs, when there's been a theft of resident belongings. So in this space, theft of resident belongings requires a little bit more attention and care, particularly because this is a much more vulnerable population that we're dealing with here. So, and that's for a few reasons. One being they're generally of older age. Two, they often have acute medical issues that require, consistent medical care. A lot of the times they may involve memory or mental incapacities. So thinking about that, and also, of course, this is where they live. So they often have valuable items, family heirlooms, jewelry, even large amounts of cash. And so thinking about those potential vulnerabilities will play a big role here. So let's jump right into the discussion. So Luke, how do these incidents of theft of resident belongings arise in this industry?
Yeah, it's interesting because we are dealing with such a vulnerable population in this context that these situations of theft are not unique, unfortunately. As you mentioned, these residents live in these facilities. This is their home. And with that, they're going to be bringing personal belongings of perhaps significant value, including jewelry, other personal mementos, and oftentimes cash. So these items are oftentimes in the room. Whether they're properly secured or not is often a big issue in context in which they come up. And we oftentimes will have employees of the facility regularly in and out of the rooms, whether that be housekeeping, nursing, or other support staff, who are regularly going in and out of the rooms and perhaps exposed to these residents' personal belongings. So each case is going to be presented on a different case-by-case basis and different scenario. But the fact that these individuals, these residents, are living in the facility and bringing their personal items does present challenges for employers in the context of potential theft situations.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper here. So let's say we have a resident who's reported an alleged theft to a manager or a supervisor or someone in HR. How does the investigation start, and what steps does the employer need to take here?
Yeah, I think the first step would be to for the employer to review their policies. Oftentimes, there may be a policy in place that lays out a foundation or a framework for conducting these investigations. So, step one would be certainly looking at those policies, as well as looking at potential admission agreements with the residents. Perhaps there's some discussion about investigations relating to theft of belongings in those admission agreements with the residents and their families. Um, More generally, our recommendation typically is to, number one, understand what the complaint is. Where did it come from? Did it come from a resident? Did it come from a third party? Was it anonymous? So the employer needs to really understand what the nature of the complaint is and where it came from. And with that, they'll understand a bit more of the context in which the complaint was made or the issue was raised. Step two, I think, is important to understand who may have been present. Are there any witnesses to this incident? Perhaps there were multiple individuals in the room when the alleged item was taken. Perhaps there weren't. So oftentimes there won't be witnesses in these situations. It's not uncommon, obviously, for housekeepers to be in a resident's room on their own. And that is oftentimes the context in which these situations do arise. But identifying potential witnesses is critical to this process. Next would be identifying a lead investigator. It's important to have a third party, removed, independent judgment or voice to conduct the investigation. We want to typically avoid having direct managers or supervisors conduct these investigations. So it's typically recommended that someone in HR or another third party kind of independent person would initiate and complete the investigation. And obviously, with that, we'll want to have conversations with each of the witnesses to the extent there are third-party witnesses. And that's going to be important to kind of understanding whether or not anybody witnessed what happened. Obviously, the most important conversation will be the person who reported the incident, coupled with any alleged person who stole the item. So identifying the potential witnesses and having those conversations is critical. Doing that expeditiously is really important. So to avoid any potential lapse in memory, etc. Other pieces of the investigation that are really important for employers to consider are looking at security surveillance. Oftentimes, there's going to be video cameras or surveillance cameras throughout the facility. Unfortunately, they're typically not going to be in a resident's room, which is the common place for these thefts to have occurred. But they oftentimes will be in the hallways. So it's important for employers to look at those surveillance tapes to see if they can find any information to further their investigation. And it's also important for employers to look at them quickly, because surveillance tape is often overwritten over a certain period of time. So it's important for employers to identify any potentially relevant tape to ensure that tape is not overwritten. So in terms of an investigation, just to kind of recap, I think it's identifying witnesses, having those conversations with the witnesses, looking at surveillance tape, coupled with review of employer procedures and potential admission agreements to help guide the process, to ensure that the investigation is completed thoroughly and to avoid any open questions at the completion of the investigation.
Absolutely. And just to kind of add to that as a practice tip, and maybe potentially a lesson learned the hard way for me, really important. You mentioned, expeditious witness interviews, especially in this space. It's a really transient employee population. There's a lot of turnover. It happens very fast. Employees are, very in and out, given that it's just a tougher, it's a tougher industry. It's a tougher, workplace environment. So getting those witness interviews really quickly, soon after they happen, it's a lot easier to get those witness interviews and potentially even written statements from those employees while they're still employees versus after they've already departed. So timing is really everything, and efficiency is everything.
Absolutely.
So, what about contacting authorities? I mean, we're talking about theft here, so there are potential, I would imagine, criminal implications here. So, what do you suggest about contacting authorities and what's required?
Yeah, I think the contacting authorities piece is kind of unique in this setting because we, number one, have law enforcement. We have the local police or whoever the local law enforcement agency is, but we also have potential regulatory agencies that we need to contact. So, with respect to law enforcement, if we have a situation where we've confirmed that is not simply a resident misplacing an item and it's truly an employee theft scenario, it's recommended and sometimes required in a particular state that authorities are contacted. For example, there are certain states that might have a requirement for employers to contact legal authorities in the event an item was stolen that exceeds a certain monetary value. So certainly, consideration of contacting local law enforcement is critical, and to the extent they do become involved, cooperating with them and allowing the agency or the authorities to conduct their investigation and assisting them throughout that process. And secondly, contacting local or state agencies. The assisted living industry is kind of a patchwork of regulations and rules. There's no real federal oversight, and it's guided by state regulations. So, certainly looking at your state regulatory structure and requirements to understand what needs to be reported. Is this a reportable event? And if so, certainly following the processes laid out in your state to report the event. And again, assist with that investigation because we want to certainly allow a third party to come in and conduct their own independent investigation to allow us to come to the clearest conclusion as to what happened and then ultimately take the appropriate action as necessary.
Thank you. Awesome. So let's kind of switch gears and kind of close out our discussion with some best practices. So let's talk about kind of what we need to think about. What are some sort of real life practice pointers? So what are some helpful tips for employers in this space, particularly to mitigate the potential risks around this type of incident taking place, and how to address them? So we can start with policies and auditing. What do we think about here?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going. First is for employers to certainly look at their policies, both on the employee-facing side as well as the resident-facing side. So, with respect to employees, employers will have numerous policies with respect to appropriate behavior, conduct, etc. It's important for employers in this context, given this specific issue, to have specific policies with respect to resident thefts. And these policies should obviously warn and notify employees that theft of resident belongings is not acceptable and likely unlawful, but also should guide employers as to how we address the situations. So it should provide a framework for conducting the investigation. It should lay out who the appropriate person is to conduct the investigation. It should recommend certain steps to take as part of the investigation. And then it should provide some certain sort of guidance with respect to disciplinary action. So with these situations, there's in many cases going to be an alleged wrongdoer. And it's the employer's obligation to determine whether or not they believe that individual actually engaged in the conduct. And to the extent we confirm conclusively that the person did engage in the theft, whether by their own admission or some other objective evidence, disciplinary action will need to be taken. So it's important for employers to have information and a policy laying out what that potential disciplinary action will be up to and including termination. And it's with respect to the discipline, it's important for employers to be consistent with their practices. And follow what they've done in the past to the extent that makes the most sense. So yeah, step one would be looking at policies with respect to employees. Also looking at admission agreements, like I mentioned earlier. and notifying residents that they should ensure that all their belongings are locked up to avoid these situations. So it's important to look at policies, procedures, and agreements with residents to ensure that these situations don't come up, and if they do, that they're addressed appropriately.
Definitely. I think policies, agreements, and I'll add to that training. Those are kind of the three big things you always want to think about, regardless of the industry or context, but policies, agreements, and training. And I'll touch on training. Of course, regular training, not just, when an employee is hired, is super important. That's something that is consistently coming up in cases, at least in my experience, is this argument that, training is only happening one time, and that's upon hire, upon orientation, and that, they could be employed there for several years and not have this kind of re-up training. So having consistent training on what the appropriate steps are, in the event of theft of resident property, and also within that training, very clear and unambiguous steps, a very specific outline of what steps need to be taken by the employee, so that there's no ambiguity as to who they need to report it to, what they need to do, how they need to document it. I mean, having something that's very clear leaves really nothing to the imagination. And in addition to that, in addition to having regular trainings on this, it's great, obviously, to do that, but it's even better to make sure that the training is documented and that we know who actually attended. There have been cases, that I've seen where an employee has been accused, and they swore up and down that they were, at that latest training, but, they didn't sign the sign-in sheet. I mean, it could be something as simple as that. It could be something as simple as a sign-in sheet or, a check-in sheet, anything like that, just confirming that person was in attendance.
If I may, Ra, just on the training point, I mean, I mentioned policies and procedures, but in my experience, training is important, more important than that. Training really is a direct communication to the staff. Employees can acknowledge receipt of policies, but they may not have actually read the policies. But training, we know that they were there. We verbally communicated. Ideally, that's in person. So having regular training, whether that be semi-annually, annually at a minimum, is critical. And I think where you were going was the training is really important as to potential claims and defensive litigations. So it's important for employers to have those acknowledgments that individuals attended the training and what was discussed during the training, because that will really help the employer in the event there are claims on the back end with respect to this employee theft situation.
Yeah. And, look, at the end of the day, employers are hiring people, right? And they're doing the best that they can with hiring the best qualified, most honest candidates that they can. But at the end of the day, it does come down to who you hire and how much trust you're able to put in them. So a really important point, kind of before any of this takes place, is the appropriate screening in candidates, specifically conducting background checks. Oftentimes we're seeing with clients in this industry and outside of this industry that also have a similar sort of higher sensitivity environment, that they're conducting these background checks, but they're extending offer letters and actually allowing them to start while that background check is still pending. So really important to either make sure that background check has come back and has cleared before they actually enter into the workplace, start performing their job duties, or, you make that offer letter contingent on, return of a clear background check. So have it be, pending or contingent, and kind of qualify that offer letter. It's really important to follow up on that and make sure that background check is cleared, instead of just kind of forgetting about it.
Yeah, that's really important, especially in this regulated industry or highly regulated industry on the state level. Employers should certainly review the regulatory requirements with respect to background checks and make sure that they're conducting that in accordance with those requirements, and certainly not having individuals begin working prior to clearance of those background checks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Luke, you touched on this, but the last piece of advice I think we can both confidently give is just to really take all complaints seriously, treat every situation impartially, and document everything, even the complaint coming in itself. Oftentimes, it's a verbal complaint. It's someone going up to their supervisor or manager or someone in HR, in person. So, just following that up with an email. Hey, this is what we talked about, just so that it's documented.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's really critical for employers to not to rush to judgment, not to assume something happened before conducting their investigation and getting a thorough understanding as to what did happen. So, I think it's conducting a thorough investigation, keeping an open mind are critical to mitigate any potential risks in these situations.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for listening. If you have any questions on this topic or any others, feel free to reach out to Luke or myself. You can find our information on the Jackson Lewis website. And otherwise, we appreciate you listening, and we'll see you on the next podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on We Get Work. Please tune in to our next program, where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.